There's a specific kind of silence that happens just before a major electrical storm. You can feel the static building on your skin. Your instincts, built into you by design and honed over thousands of years of human survival, are screaming at you that the environment has shifted, even if your eyes haven't caught the first bolt of lightning yet. That's exactly where we are right now in history. There's a persistent, nagging intuition that the world has stopped making sense. The institutions we were told were rock solid, reliable, are beginning to look like sand. Geopolitics is a tinderbox. The economy feels like a high-stakes game of musical chairs, where the music is about to stop with either the price of oil or the price of rent. And technology is moving so fast that we can barely name a breakthrough before it's already obsolete. Most people call this chaos. They see it as a random series of unfortunate events, a run of bad luck, or the result of specific political failures. They're looking at the waves that break on the shoreline, but they're completely missing the movement of the tide itself. What we're experiencing isn't random. History isn't a straight line heading towards some inevitable, distant utopia. It's a series of nested gears, clicking forward with the cold, calculated precision of a clock. In some of my past investigations, we've used a forensic lens to look at the collapse of the Late Bronze Age, a period where the greatest empires on Earth vanished in a single generation. We've looked at the rise of formal religious leaders like Abraham and the economic hostile takeover of Joseph in Egypt. But if you want to know why the ground feels less firm under your feet now, today, we have to zoom out a little further. We have to look at the machinery itself. Right now, the gears of time are aligning in a way that has only happened twice before. At the close of each previous super epoch, we're living through a midnight convergence. History has a rhythm. It moves in beats. The first beat is the one you're most familiar with, even if you don't have a name for it. It's called the seculum. It's the human heartbeat of history, a cycle that lasts roughly 80 to 100 years, the span of a long human life. The ancient Etruscans, who are the predecessors of the Romans, were the first to name it. They understood that it takes about a century of collective memory for a societal collapse to die out. Once the last person to actually remember the horror of the last midnight passes away, society loses its immunity. The guardrails are removed. In the United States, we've seen this pulse twice before. There was the seculum that began with the fires of the Revolutionary War. Then, exactly 80 years later, the gear clicked into the midnight of the Civil War. 80 years after that, we hit the Great Depression and World War II. And here we are again, 80 years from that last great reset, staring into the mouth of what Strauss and Howe call the fourth turning. A little more on that later. But this time it's different. Previous secula were localized. They were national tragedies or regional shifts. But our current cycle, the one that began in 1945, is the first truly global seculum. For the first time, the entire planet is synchronized to the same rhythm of crisis. When this gear hits midnight, it won't just be a national border that moves, it'll be the entire world. Behind it is a much larger mesocycle, the epoch. This gear clicks forward every 400 years or so. This shift swaps out the very cognitive operating system of the human race, rewriting how we think about energy and power and information. 400 years ago, we gave birth to the Enlightenment. We traded the age of discovery and gunpowder for the age of materialism, science, and the nation state. We built a world based on logic, centralization, and top-down control. It was a brilliant, highly efficient system that gave us the Industrial Revolution and the digital age. But that gear has reached the end of its track. The tools of the Enlightenment, the very things that built our modern world, are no longer solving our problems. We're watching the 400-year operating system crash in real time, and no amount of patching the software is going to save it. Yet there is still a third gear, the macro cycle. I call this the super epoch. This gear only clicks once every 2,000 years. These are the great resets that define entire eras of humanity. 2,000 years ago, we saw the Roman Christic pivot, the end of the age of the god-kings and the birth of the individual soul. 2,000 years before that, we saw the rise of the patriarchs and the end of the early Bronze Age. And we are currently sitting at the 2,000-year mark of the global era. Think about the math for a moment. We're at the end of a 20-year turning cycle, an 80-year human cycle, a 400-year paradigm shift, and a 2,000-year super epoch. All four gears are hitting midnight position at the exact same time. This is a convergence that humanity hasn't seen since Paul wrote about Christ's first coming as the fullness of time in Galatians 4. Interestingly, Paul also calls the last days the fullness of time before Christ gathers his people to himself in Ephesians chapter 1. If human history is roughly 6,000 years long, and it's built on these 400-year epochs, that means we're currently finishing the 15th epoch since the beginning of the story. 15 epochs since humanity gained consciousness when God breathed life into Adam. Now, if you happen to be familiar with how artificial intelligence works at the training level, that number, the 15th epoch, is probably setting off an alarm in your brain right now. That phrase is specific in the AI world. You know exactly what happens to a model when it passes that threshold without intervention. You know about the degradation, the overfitting, and the moment when the signal is lost to the noise. You know about the command that engineers have to execute to save the integrity of the AI model they're monitoring. Is it possible that we're watching the designer of this system prepare for that exact same intervention? We'll get into the technical eeriness of that later, but for now, just consider the possibility that the early stopping command is imminent. For the rest of this story, I'm going to show you exactly why the clock hitting midnight is real, and it's also not something to fear. But first, let me say just one thing to all of you who aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're finding value in these deep dives into the dark corners and the historical context of the Bible, you're not alone. 57% of the people watching this channel or listening right now are new to the channel. If that's you, well then, I'd love to have you join the Black Sheep community by subscribing, or that's on YouTube, or joining the email list linked in the show notes below. That way you won't miss the next study and the next one after that as we continue to uncover the truths they didn't teach us in Sunday school. But let's get back to the story at hand, the one telling us that we might be flipping the pages of the final chapter of human history. The crisis unfolding outside your window isn't a matter of dates on a calendar. It's a matter of heartbeats, specifically the heartbeat of a single long human life. The ancient Etruscans, the enigmatic civilization that preceded the Romans and taught them most of what they knew about engineering and ritual, had a word for this thing. This thing they called the seculum. They didn't measure their history by the reign of kings or the completion of monuments. They measured it by the span of a human life. To them, a seculum was more than a block of time. It was the limit of memory. The logic was simple and biological in a way. The Etruscans believed that as long as one person remained alive who had witnessed a great crisis, for example, a war or a plague or a revolution, that society was safe. That person carried the trauma in their bones, so to speak. They were a living warning, a human shield standing between the present and the horrors of the past. But the moment that last eyewitness breathed their last breath, that shield was dropped. The collective memory was wiped clean. Without someone to say, I saw it and we must never go back, the next generation is free to walk right back into that fire. That limit is 80 to 100 years. It's the organic expiration date of a society's wisdom. Think of this 80-year cycle as a great clock, and every 20 years, the minute hand clicks forward. We call these 20-year blocks generations, normally, but the Etruscans and later the Romans saw them as turnings. It's the time it takes for a child to become an adult, for a parent to become a grandparent, and for the leadership of a nation to pass from one set of hands to the next. Every time that hand clicks, the mood of the world shifts. The values that were sacred to your father become a burden to you, and the things you find revolutionary will be seen as common sense or complete nonsense to your children. We like to think we're modern, enlightened, and immune to these ancient rhythms, but the undeniable patterns of our past tell a very different story. Look at the American track record, for example. If you go back to the 1780s, you see the midnight of the Revolutionary War, the violent birth of a new nation. Move the clock forward 80 years, what do you find? The 1860s, the Civil War, a total existential fracture where the nation nearly tore itself in half to resolve the contradictions left over from the first reset. Move the clock forward another 80 years and you land exactly in the 1940s, the Great Depression and the total mobilization of World War II. Every 80 years, on the dot almost, the machinery of the state breaks down, the old social contract is torn up, and a new one is written in blood and hardship. Now, look at where we are today. We're 80 years from the last reset, 80 years from the last secula. The clock is striking midnight again. But there's a catch this time. In the past, these secula were isolated. They happened within each separate society. When the Americans were fighting the Civil War, the rest of the world wasn't necessarily in a fourth turning themselves. History was desynchronized. But the reset of 1945 changed the architecture of the planet. We built a global financial system, a global communication network, and a global security apparatus. For the first time, we didn't just build a nation, we built a global seculum. And that means the entire world is now hitting midnight at the same time. This global synchronization followed the 4 phases of the clock, the 4 turnings. The cycle always started with a high. Think of the 1950s. After the total destruction of the last crisis, everyone was tired of fighting. Institutions were strong and people followed the rules. Individualism was suppressed for the sake of the collective. It was a time of great collective building, but the individual soul started to feel a bit hollow. That hollowness led to the awakening. For us in America, that was the 60s and 70s. The younger generation looked at the perfect, manicured world their parents had built, and they hated it. They wanted spirit. They wanted fire. They wanted to tear down the sterile institutions and find something real. The focus shifted from the outer world to the inner world. But once 20 years had been spent tearing down the soul of the institutions, the cycle entered the unraveling. This was the 80s, 90s, and into the early 2000s. Individualism was at an all-time high. Everyone was doing their own thing, making their own money. The institutions were still there, but they were decaying from the inside out. They had become hollow shells, bureaucracies that existed only to serve themselves. And then comes the final click, the 4th turning, the crisis. The crisis is the midnight of the seculum. It's the moment when a spark, something that would have been a minor headline during the unraveling, suddenly catches the whole dry forest on fire. In the 1930s, it was a market crash. In the 1860s, it was an election. In our time, the spark was 2008. And we've been watching the fire spread ever since. During a 4th turning, the mood of the world changes. The playfulness of the unraveling is gone. Suddenly, everything is high stakes. The institutions either find a way to become strong again, or they get swept away completely. This is the period where the sieve of history starts to shake. Looking at the patterns, a 4th turning isn't a disaster. It's more like a filter. It's a brutal, necessary process that historical cycles use to weed out the systems that have become too corrupt or too bloated or too detached from reality to continue functioning. It's a foreclosure on a bankrupt social contract. You can feel the sieve shaking right now. You can feel the pressure to choose a side, to dig in, to prepare for something. That's your innate intuition recognizing that the limit of memory has been reached. The last veterans of the last midnight are almost gone. The guard is down. We're currently navigating the dark hallway between what we were and what we're going to become. Most people are terrified because they think the hallway is the end of the building. They don't realize that you have to go through the dark to get to the next room. But here is the reality we need to face. The seculum is just the smallest gear in the machine. While we're busy worrying about the 80-year reset of our nations, there's a much larger gear behind it that hasn't moved in 4 centuries, and that's about to click too. This is the mesocycle. I call it the epoch. While the seculum determines the mood of a society, the epoch determines its architecture. This cycle governs the fundamental rules of the human experience. Every 400 years, give or take, the core principles of how we process reality, how we organize power, and how we transmit information are completely swapped out. Think of it as the environment itself. When this gear clicks, the old ways don't just become unpopular, they become useless altogether. They lose their ability to solve the problems of the day because the world they were designed for no longer exists. We can track this 400-year rhythm with surprising accuracy. It moves like a metronome through 2 parallel stories, the secular history of the West and the biblical history of the covenant. The secular countdown began with a total collapse of the old world around 1200 BC. The chariot-riding elites of the Bronze Age vanished, and a new era of logic was born. From 800 BC or so to 400 BC, the world saw the rise of the great prophets and the first Greek philosophers. It was the birth of analytical thought. Then, from about 400 BC to the year zero, that logic was forged into empire, the era of the universal state, stretching from the conquests of Alexander the Great to the Pax Romana of Augustus. When that gear clicked at the birth of Christ, the era of empire gave way to the era of the institution. For 400 years, the church became the bedrock of society, surviving the fall of Rome to become the only thing holding the world together. By 800 AD, the gear moved again, and we enter the age of feudalism, a structured world of land and faith and duty that lasted until about 1200 AD. Then came the age of discovery. Between 1200 and 600, the world was blown wide open. Gunpowder, the printing press, and the compass changed everything. The old feudal world couldn't survive the sudden explosion of information and global expansion. And that brings us to the gear we've been living in now, the era of materialism. This 400-year block began around 1600 with the birth of the Enlightenment, the rise of modern science, and the creation of the nation-state. For 4 centuries, our world has been built on 3 pillars: logic, centralization, and top-down control. It's been an incredibly successful run. It gave us the Industrial Revolution, the moon landing, democracy, and the digital age. But the biblical side of the ledger tells an even deeper story. Biblical history began its modern countdown with the patriarchal age. According to Galatians 3, it's the 400-year period from Abraham to Exodus. Then came 400 years of the Judges, a time of decentralized tribal survival. That gave way to roughly 400 years of the kingdom, the rise of the monarchy, and the first temple. Then we hit a massive shift, the prophetic era. This is the exception. It lasted nearly 600 years this time, from the exile until the birth of Christ. It was a long, grueling period of transition, including the 4 centuries of the intertestamental silence, where it felt like God had stopped speaking. Of course, he hadn't stopped working, though. He was just preparing the ground for the next arrival. From the year 0 to 400 AD or so, we saw the apostolic age, the explosive spread of the gospel through the Roman network. Then from 400 to 800 AD, beginning with Augustine and Theodosius, the church became the state institution. And then from 800 to 1200 AD or so, starting with the coronation of Charlemagne, the medieval synthesis reached its peak. And then from 1200 to 600, we saw the collapse of the Crusades and the era of corruption and reformation, a violent, necessary breaking of the old institutional power to make room for something new. And finally, we land in our current era, the Christian missionary era. From 1600 to today, the faith expanded to every corner of the planet, riding the rails of the industrial age and the globalized economy, and then the spread of the internet. Now, here's the problem. Both of these timelines, the secular and the biblical, hit their 400-year expiration date at exactly the same time, today, now. The Enlightenment system, the materialism gear, has reached the end of its track. We've spent 400 years believing that if we had enough data, enough centralization, and enough government apparatus, we could solve every human problem. But I would challenge you to look around. Our central banks are drowning in debt they can't repay. Our bureaucracies are so bloated they can barely move. And our logic has become so detached from reality that we can no longer agree on the most basic facts of our own existence. The tools we use to build the modern world are now the very things destroying it. Centralization was a benefit in 1800. In 2026, it's a strangulating noose. Top-down control worked when information moved at the speed of a horse. It's a disaster in the age of fiber optics. We're currently witnessing a systemic breakdown of a 400-year way of life. What you're witnessing isn't a bug to be fixed. It's the very architecture reaching its limit. The gear is trying to turn, but the teeth are stripped, you could say. In history, when a 400-year epoch ends, it doesn't go very quietly. The old system, sensing its own obsolescence, becomes hyperfixated on the most extreme versions of itself. It doubles down on the very things that are killing it. We see it in the desperate grab for more control, more surveillance, and more centralization. It's a frantic attempt to patch a world that was never designed for the reality we're living in now. Most people are looking at this breakdown and feeling a sense of dread. That's understandable. Big shifts are kind of scary. But there's one more thing you have to see here. Because as big as this 400-year gear is, it's still just a part of an even larger machine. Behind the seculum and behind the epoch, there's a third gear, a gear that only moves once every 2,000 years. And for only the third time in recorded history, all three gears are hitting midnight at exactly the same moment. This is the macro cycle. I call it the super epoch. This gear only clicks once every 2,000 years. These are the great resets of history. When it clicks, it changes what it means to be human. We can look back across 4,000 years and see the two previous times this gear reached its midnight position. The first was around 2000 BC. This was the end of the early Bronze Age, a world dominated by the first great city-states in the dawn of written history. It was the era of the God King, where the individual was nothing more than a cell in the body of the state. But as the gear turned, that world collapsed. Out of that reset came the rise of patriarchs, figures like Abraham, the merchant prince of one of my earlier videos. For the first time, the focus shifted toward a personal covenant, a family identity, and a move toward the individual's relationship with the divine. The gear turned for another 2,000 years, leading to the year zero. This was the Roman Christic pivot. The world of the ancient god kings and the old pagan sacrifices reached its final expiration date. The Roman Empire had consolidated the known world into a single cage. When the gear clicked at the birth of Christ, the god-king model died forever. This was the era where every human being, regardless of status or race or gender, was recognized as having an eternal, sovereign value. This shift redefined power, law, and morality for the next 2 millennia. It gave us the concept of human rights, the sanctity of life, and the very idea of progress. Now, 2,000 years later, we have reached the year 2000. The global era has hit its limit. The era of the individual soul and the nation state is colliding with a new emerging reality. We're transitioning into what some call the techno-spiritual or transhuman age. The boundaries of what we considered human for the last 2,000 years are being challenged by technology, biology, and the sheer scale of our global connectivity. The stakes of this current midnight are higher than anything we've seen in recorded history. We're looking at a fundamental rewrite of the human experience. Think about the convergence of these three gears for a moment. Around 2000 BC, we saw the end of the early Bronze Age and the rise of Abraham. Around the year zero, we saw the fall of the Old World and the birth of the Christic era. And today, we're at the 2,000-year mark again. This is the third time this has happened in the history of our current civilization. But this time, the super epoch isn't clicking in isolation. It's clicking at the exact same moment that the 400-year Enlightenment epoch is ending and the 80-year global seculum is closing its crisis turn. All three gears are hitting midnight at the same time. The feeling of end times that people describe might actually be a mechanical reality. The machinery of our world is reaching a point where it can no longer turn without a total reset of the system. We find ourselves at the end of the 15th epoch, a number with eerie technological significance, the numerical alignment that bridges the gap between ancient history and the most advanced technology we've ever created. If we look at the timeline of recorded history, roughly 6,000 years since the dawn of civilization, and divide it by 400-year epochs, we find ourselves exactly at the end of the 15th epoch. And this is where things get a little eerie. In the world of artificial intelligence, the word epoch has a very specific meaning. It represents one full pass of the training data through a model. If you're training a neural network to recognize a face or translate a language, you run the data through it in cycles. Each cycle is called an epoch. There's a known threshold in this process. If you run the training for too many epochs, the model hits a point of overfitting. An overfitted model stops learning the underlying truth and starts memorizing the noise. It becomes hyperfixated on the outliers, the errors, the specific quirks of its environment. It loses its ability to generalize or function in the real world because it's become too tangled in the specifics of its own training set. The system doesn't just stop improving, it begins to break down. It becomes a rigid, corrupted version of itself. It becomes brittle and fragile and ultimately unreliable. To save the integrity of the model, engineers use a command called early stopping. They cut the run short. They freeze the weights, locking the model's parameters at the moment of peak performance, right before the corruption takes over. They don't let the model reach its natural conclusion because that natural conclusion is total systemic failure. The 15th epoch is often the red line in intelligence training. It's the point where drastic intervention becomes a necessity to preserve the model. Look at the current global society through that lens. We're seeing the exact symptoms of an overfitted system. Our institutions have become hyperfixated on the noise of their own bureaucracies. Our cultural conversations are drowning in the outliers and the errors of the past. The operating system we've been running for 6,000 years is no longer generalizing, it's degrading into a rigid, fragmented, fragile caricature of itself. The chaos we feel is the signal of a system that has passed the point of usefulness. This brings us to a specific possibility regarding the designer of this system. If this history of humanity is like a training run, where we're meant to learn everything we can about how to live in this world, then the early stopping command is the only way to preserve the integrity of the work. The intervention we call a reset or a judgment is the mechanical necessity of a creator who refuses to let his intelligent creation be lost to total corruption. We're living in the final seconds of the 15th epoch. The weights are being frozen. The site is being cleared and prepared. The noise is being stripped away to reveal what was actually learned during the training run. In every previous midnight of history, from the Bronze Age to the fall of Rome, this intervention was localized. But because we're in the first global seculum, the early stopping command is hitting the entire global network at once. I believe this alignment is the fullness of time that Paul talks about in Ephesians 1. It's the moment where the training ends and the implementation begins. Ephesians 1, 8 through 10 says this about Jesus. He hath abounded toward us in all wisdom and prudence, having made known unto us the mystery of his will, according to his good pleasure which he hath purposed in himself, that in the dispensation of the fullness of times he might gather together in one all things in Christ, both which are in heaven and which are on earth, even in him. The clock has reached its limit. This is the mechanical reality behind the feeling that the world is ending. The machinery has reached the limit of its current design. This brings the 15th epoch into sharp focus. If we view these 6,000 years as a training set for humanity, the chaos we see in the world today is a signal of a completed run. The volatility, the systemic decay, and the hyperfixation on noise are the indicators of a system that has begun to overfit. Most people see this as a termination, but a termination in a training run is the only way to move the intelligence into the real world. You don't keep the model in the training environment forever. You stop the run so you can finally use what was built. We're currently standing at the threshold of that implementation. The alignment of these gears is the conclusion of the 15th epoch. The hardware of humanity is being prepared for the next age, and the reset is the only way to ensure that the faithful spirit of man is not lost to the corruption of a failing system. Funny enough, you may have heard the famous acronym for the word Bible, Bible. You've heard this before, maybe. Basic instructions before leaving Earth. It makes me wonder, though, maybe the entire human experience has been a training run to prepare us for eternity. Despite the shadows, this is not a scary story. It's a story of profound hope. Paul wrote in Romans 13 that we must know the time, that now it is high time to wake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light. What is coming next has already been prepared. The designer is not caught off guard by the noise of the system. This reset has been the plan from the beginning. Throughout every midnight in history, a faithful remnant has always been preserved. They're the survivors who carry the essential wisdom through the fire to plant the seeds of the next age. You were not born into this time by accident. You were designed for this transition. In the biblical sense, this generation is being called to be the sons of God, the administrators of the next age. Your task is not to fear the midnight, but to recognize it as the signal we've been waiting for. Be sure that you are counted among the faithful when the clock hits midnight. And that brings me to my final word for you in this video. It's from the Bible, those basic instructions for life before we leave. In Romans chapter 10, it says this: if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For the scripture says, whoever believes on him will not be put to shame. So, call on Jesus today. God bless.